This is your host, Danny, and this is Common Mistakes from English Plus Podcast. In this episode of Common Mistakes, we're going to talk about common mistakes with the word example. And for that, let me give you an example. Medicine is a good example for something that we pass from one generation to the next. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is with the preposition. And this is a very common mistake. People say a good example for something. Well, we don't say a good example or an example for something. It's an example of something, not for of something. For example, we say, he is a classic example of a man who cannot control his ambition. A classic example of a man. So back to our example, we should say medicine is a good example of something that we passed from one generation to the next. Let me give you another example. A manager is supposed to give a good example. Well, what's wrong with that? We didn't say of or for, so we should be fine, right? Yes, but no. Well, actually, the problem is not with the preposition because we don't need a preposition in the first place here. But the problem is with the verb we used with example. We don't give a good example. I am giving you examples now. That's right, but not in the meaning that we have here. The manager is supposed to give a good example of what? If this is the case, you would say, give a good example of what? Now, I'm giving you examples of common mistakes. That's fine. I can give an example if I want to tell you that this is a mistake, this is wrong, this is right, especially in this episode of Common Mistakes. But instead of give an example here, we should say set an example or set a good example. That means behave correctly so that the people who copy you will behave correctly. For example, now I will give you an example now. I'm not setting an example. I am giving you an example now. The school captain is expected to set a good example, not to give a good example. Example of what? Set a good example, to behave correctly so that everybody can copy him and behave correctly just like him. But as I told you, in teaching, of course, you can say give examples. For example, we say, instead of trying to explain the theory, he just gave us a few good examples. Not set. Set, that's different. So you will need to understand the difference between set a good example or give a good example. These are both right, but they mean two different things. So back to our sentence, we should say a manager is supposed to set a good example, not to give a good example. With that being said, that's everything I wanted to share with you about the common mistakes we make with the word example. Another day, another common mistake. This is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening to another Common Mistakes episode from English Plus Podcast. I'll see you next time.